Okay.
Great. Welcome. So excited for this session. Please go ahead, Jasmine.
Okay. If you can let me know in the chat whether or not you can see my screen. I'm still getting used to my new screen and sharing it, so that would be very, very helpful. Thank you. Thank you. Alrighty, y'all. So I am very excited to be here with you all this morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are joining me. This is gonna sound kind of weird, but can we just collectively kind of do a cleansing breath, like just inhale together and then exhale. I just feel like there's so much going on in our worlds, and just taking a moment just to breathe. It helps me to ground myself, and I hope it kind of helps you to do the same here. So my MyFest session for today is about dreaming. It's about imagining. I think that is something that we are not afforded a lot. We don't carve out enough space to do that. We have a lot of thoughts about dreaming and imagining. I know there is a group in MyFest who I believe is doing a reading over Ruha Benjamin's Imagination Manifesto. And so today's workshop is going to draw heavily from that, but it's also going to draw heavily from my experiences as well, just as a human being. So the first part of the session, I will be doing a little bit more talking than what, I don't want to say than what I'd like to, but I just want to contextualize the workshop. And then the second half, we will be doing a lot of reflection. So I just want to prepare you all for that. So if you need to get paper, pens, an app on your phone, I know there are a few people who might be joining us and multitasking, and I understand that. I just ask that you all, at some point in time during our reflections, actually participate in that part. And so before I get into the agenda and all that good stuff, I do want to dedicate this session slash workshop to Palestinians who are still suffering in Gaza, who feel like people have forgotten their daily horrors that they experience. I have a radical dream of a free Palestine, and I also dream of a world where that is not controversial to say. And I also want to dedicate this session to Sonia Massey, who is a Black American woman who was recently killed by the police in her own home after she had called them for help. And so part of my dream is dreaming of a world where Black women can be safe, where we are not anyone's mules, for lack of better words, where we know that people care about our experiences, where we don't have to constantly negotiate this fragile space between hope and then outright fear. And so, yes, my presentation or workshop today is definitely dedicated to those two situations. And so, actually, for some reason, my PowerPoint isn't moving, so I'm actually going to stop sharing and figure out what's going on. Okay. It did this earlier in a presentation that I had, so I'm not sure. Okay. We're almost there, y'all. Okay. And then I'm gonna go ahead and start this over. All right. What about now, y'all? Can y'all see that, the disclaimer? Okay. Awesome. Sorry about that. So I've already kind of talked about these disclaimers. So we're going to be doing a lot of journaling or reflecting the second half of this workshop. So I just wanted to kind of give you all a heads up. And then also in my contextualization of how I approach imagining and dreaming, I will be mentioning things like collective trauma and death by suicide as an act of refusal and resistance. I'm in no way promoting that, but I just wanted to let you all know that I am mentioning that within my workshop here. And so to kind of kick us off, I would love for us to just do a quick discussion in the chat. I'd love to know who's here? Where are you in this wonderful world that we live in? And more importantly, who are you bringing into this space? That whether that be people from your past, people presently, or people that you're thinking about in the future. So I'll kind of kick it off for you all. So again, I'm Jasmine Roberts-Crews. I am in what is now known as Columbus, Ohio, in the United States. And I am bringing with me a lot of different folks, but primarily, of course, I'm bringing my ancestors. I'm going to be talking about them a great deal in my contextualization of dreaming and imagining. I come from a family of dreamers. Dreaming is a practice within my family, so I'm bringing that lens deeply into this workshop. But presently, I'm also bringing my nieces and my nephew. Later on in today's session, I'm going to talk about how we should look to children when we're talking about imagining. They're great leaders, source of examples of dreaming and imagining and in play. And so I'm bringing that lens as well, those babies who I love dearly into today's session. And yeah, let me go ahead and get to the chat and see who is all here and who are we bringing into this space. Oh, hello, Mia. It's so nice to see that you're here. And if you need a moment to think about who you're bringing into this space, that is perfectly fine. Hi, Heather. Bringing her daughter and peers and hopes for a future full of dreaming and hope. Yes. Christina is bringing their teenage son into this space with me as they think about his future. Yes. Yeah, I love that. So many of us are bringing our family into this space. This is not just for us, it's for our broader community. I love that. Gianna, I hope I'm saying your name correctly, from New Jersey, bringing her family as well. Two new baby cousins. Oh my gosh, that's so exciting. Great. Thank you. Thank you. Hello, Jenny from Manchester. I love it. Your students, yes. I probably should have mentioned my students too. For some reason, as I was coming into this space, I just thought so much of my family. But yes, students are kind of, I view them as kind of an extended family, if you will. Absolutely. Heather, originally from Toledo, Ohio. Heather, I'm from Toledo, Ohio. Oh my goodness. I went to start high school there. That's so amazing. Joining from Germany, bringing my family into this space as well. I'm sure you're dreaming of futures for your family. Awesome, awesome. Oh, that's awesome, Heather. Hi, Mia. Mia's bringing her ancestors from all over the world and from unconnected cultures. I am uncanny result of random cultural convergences. I kind of relate to that a little bit, Mia. So I appreciate you saying that. I think a lot more people can relate to that too. I'm bringing the children, all of my wonderful, amazing students. Yes. Hi again. I hope I'm saying your name correctly. From Edmonton. I was just in Edmonton last year for OE Global, bringing all the people impacted by fires in the province and in BC. I did hear about that. Yes, yes, thank you. Bring them into this space. Hi, Danny. Danny from London in Canada, Ontario, Canada, excuse me. Or they're in London, excuse me. Not sure who they're bringing into this space, and that's okay. That is okay. It's an interesting question, right? Who are we bringing into this space? Yes, from Vienna, bringing their brother and nieces and my students. Oh, awesome, Ty. Awesome, awesome. We might have probably have crossed paths. All right. So thank you so much, everyone, for just participating in that. Like I said, I'm a firm believer when we enter into these spaces, we're not entering alone. And when we're dreaming of futures, we're not just dreaming for ourselves, we're dreaming for our entire communities that we're bringing with us into this space. And so, like I said, before we collectively imagine together, I want to also contextualize my relationship to dreaming and imagination as a resistance and rebuilding practice. So, I briefly mentioned that I come from a family of women who firmly believe in the power of dreaming. These women also believe that dreams are, I guess you can say, another portal to communicate, to pause, to rest, to expand, and to listen. Pictured on the left-hand side of the slide, or left-hand side of the slide, is a photo of five generations in my direct maternal line. I showed this photo when I was one of the keynotes at the Open Education Conference last year. And take a wild guess which one is me in that top left-hand photo there. And yes, five generations of women from my maternal line, my direct maternal line. So my mother's 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 mother's. And my great grandmother, Evelyn, pictured in the pink on the bottom left-hand side of the photo, instilled this belief in us that dreams are worth paying attention to, they're worth nurturing, and most importantly, they're worth sharing. There's a lot of power in sharing your dreams with one another. And we affectionately called Evelyn Mama. And as a child, I'd visit Mama annually or so when she lived in Minnesota in the United States. And during this time, I'd study her resting in her plush white recliner that it seemed like she had for as long as I lived. And she'd zero in on something on her wall, like the same spot, it seemed like. And as she did this, she had this very pensive look, and it's still a kind of both a concern and intrigue in me. And one day I had the courage to ask Mama if she was okay. And she just said with her, she had a very warm smile and a very squeaky laugh. She said, "Yes, baby, Mama's just resting and dreaming." And I thought it was so cool to see an old woman still daydream the way that she did. As we get older, we're told that daydreaming is foolish, and it's for those who are on focus, it's for children. But I really admired that my great grandmother at the time, who at the time was maybe 80, was still daydreaming, right? And occasionally she would share her daydreams with me, although I'm mad I've forgotten much of what she shared with me because I was a child and only half listened. Luckily, my grandmother, Catherine, who is pictured on the top right-hand corner and who I call Grandmama, was also a dreamer. And she continued this practice of communal dreaming and sharing her dreams with me, her granddaughter. And again, my family firmly believes in the power of dreaming and the truths they provide to us. We don't just discard them as, these subconscious or our subconscious nagging at us, or again, daydreaming as something that's foolish. And so that's why when I read Tricia Hersey's Rest is Resistance, who's pictured on the kind of bottom right-hand side of the slide, when I read that book, I felt so seen because she also talks about how her grandmother used daydreaming as a rest practice, but also a resistant practice or resistance practice. And again, I thought, oh my Lord, that's my family too. And I didn't realize recently, or up until recently, how this familial practice of dreaming brought me so much confidence and maybe contributed to my audacious spirit. That is, how dare I imagine another option for myself and people who look like me, who share my experiences, right? Who share my hopes outside of what Western white supremacist systems offer to me, right? How dare I not adopt, as Ruha Benjamin explains in her book, and I know a lot of us are reading that book or have read that book, Imagination, a Manifesto. how dare I not adopt this dominant imagination, right? And so going back to grandmama, she was a vivid dreamer, and she would tell me as a teenager how our ancestors would speak to her regularly in her dream space, telling her how it is in the realm that they currently reside in. And she said when our ancestors visited her in her dream space, whether that be like literal dreams or daydreaming, it gave her a lot of comfort. Now, to some of you, and I'm, again, making big assumptions here, it might sound strange that I'm talking about ancestors visiting folks in their dream space. But you have to understand this comes from a long-standing belief and tradition that survived the Middle Passage and the transatlantic slave trade that my ancestors brought with them. And it is here where I introduce this concept of the flying African. And some of you might not have heard of this concept, some of you might have. And so the flying African, which I kind of have an image of an artistic expression of that on the top right-hand corner of my slide, it's sort of a folklore that exists as a dream among those Africans who were enslaved in the United States and the Caribbean. This legend points to a sort of escaping bondage and enslavement by dreaming of a reversal passage back to West and Central Africa. But there are those who believe that there is some truth to this legend, and we can sit here and debate what is truth and what is fiction. But there are documented stories from those who were formerly enslaved who just remember people, or not just remember, but who remember people just disappearing from the plantation. Now, whether or not this was a planned escape or due to some other cause, again, we can debate that, but sometimes those who were formerly enslaved would say, to explain the disappearance of Africans, they would just say, well, they must have flew back to Africa. And so an extension of this flying African legend can be found in the documented Igbo or Igbo landing site where some 75 Igbo people from Nigeria were brought to, I think it's St. Simon's Island in Georgia in the United States. And upon their landing, they took control of the ship and killed their enslavers. And they then collectively walked into deep swamps and died by suicide through drowning, a sort of active refusal to live in bondage. And so this sort of dream of the flying African, however it takes place, however it manifests, however we interpret it, is still deeply rooted in the dream space of many of those whose ancestors were formerly enslaved. It kind of provides us with the space to imagine new futures and new possibilities. And this, explaining all of this to you all reminds me, again, as I talk about dreaming, I'm bringing a deeply rooted Black feminist lens into this space, into dreaming about futures and new possibilities. Audre Lorde tells us, who's pictured on the bottom left-hand side of my slide, she reminds us and tells us, and I have a quote here, that we must constantly encourage ourselves and each other to attempt the heretical actions that our dreams imply. And so many of our old ideas disparage. And of course, my girl Toni, I love me some Toni Morrison, who's kind of on the center black and white photo here. She's dancing in that photo. She reminds us that, dream the world as it ought to be. And that quote goes on to say that don't let anybody convince you, right? This is the way the world is and therefore must be. It must be the way it ought to be. I love that quote from Toni. It definitely grounds me. So just a couple of other reflections I want to share with you all before we get into our own collective imagining. Also drawing from Ruha's imagination book, she gives us a lot of quotes to kind of chew on and really reflect on. And she includes this quote in her book from Adrienne Marie Brown. And this quote reads, "We are in an imagination battle." And so the systems that be want to win this imagination battle, right? And to some, it seems like they have. White supremacy culture wears us down, and with our constant sense of urgency and emergency and experiencing all these unprecedented events, takes a toll on us. And so it's really easy to buy into this kind of defeatist attitude, and for that to be center stage to dreaming and imagining. And, the institutions we work for even manufacture our dreams for us sometimes. They tell us, on one hand, to dream big, right? But only certain dreams. They standardize our dreams, they grade our dreams, they rank our dreams, they critique it. They kind of take the pleasure out of dreaming sometimes. And I know this because, there are some times where I ask my students to kind of let's just veer off the syllabus, to engage in this concept of play, to engage in imagination in the classroom. And sometimes when I ask them to do this, they get a little scared. And some of them even get a little irritated. It's like, no, we're supposed to be doing this. I'm the customer, right? You owe me this content, pour into my knowledge bucket. Higher education systems have kind of made dreaming scary and annoying. It's mind-blowing to me. Impossibility has become so political, so political. And to kind of draw on this quote from Adrienne Marie Brown, I do want to expand it and read the actual excuse me, from her book, Emergent Strategy, where she talks about this imagination battle. And so she writes, we are in an imagination battle. Trayvon Martin and Mike Brown and Renisha McBride and so many others are dead because, in some white imagination, they were dangerous. And that imagination is so respected that those who kill based on an imagined radicalized fear of Black people are rarely held accountable. Imagination has people thinking that they can go from being poor to a millionaire as a part of a shared American dream. Imagination turns brown bombers into terrorists and white bombers into mentally ill victims. Imagination gives us borders, gives us superiority, gives us race as an indicator of ability. I often feel I am trapped inside someone else's capability. I often feel I am trapped inside someone else's imagination, and I must engage my own imagination in order to break free. That alone, we could probably like reflect on that for the next 30 minutes. But I love how Adrienne frames that. And I love that last part, the very vulnerable way that she's describing how she feels trapped inside of someone else's imagination and how that influences her own ability to imagine. And so she's using imagination to break free of that feeling of being trapped. And then one last thing before we get to our reflections, I talk about this quote a lot of my work because outside of the Toni Morrison quote that I just talked about a few slides ago, this one from D. Ray McKenson, who's a former Black Lives Matter activist, really, really grounds my work, especially in this very polarized discourse that we're seeing in all kinds of spaces, even activist advocacy spaces. There's a lot of division going on. And D. Ray reminds us that, when we think about these systems of oppression like slavery, a genocide that we are currently witnessing, um, you have to have a wild imagination to concoct that, right? This doesn't come out of anywhere. And so we can have a wild imagination for systems of oppression. Why can we not engage in imagination for systems of liberation? So again, these things don't just happen, y'all. Much of our reality once came from imagination. And then my last thing that I want to talk about before we get into our reflections on dreaming and imagination, like I just literally just said, during this time, it seems like even there are some organizers and activists who are kind of putting forth this sort of purest dream of liberation. I find a lot of comfort in dreaming and imagining through a post-oppositional lens. And for those who have heard me talk before, you've kind of heard me mention this, but I think this framework is actually worth delving into for the next couple of minutes before we get into our reflections. So for those who don't know, post-oppositionality is a term coined by Anna Louise Keaton, and I believe she's still a professor at Texas Women's University. I could be wrong about that. But in her book, I read it for one of my classes, Transformation Now. Anna Louise explains this notion of post-oppositional resistance as an approach and practice that really transcends a lot of the oppositional consciousness that we see in a lot of social justice work and academic critique. And while Anna Louise, kind of coined this term post-oppositionality, the idea behind it is not entirely new. And we've seen other feminist scholars, indigenous peoples, and women of color educators kind of articulate a very similar argument. And that argument is for a more interconnected, relational, and post-binary way of thinking and approaching social justice. And so, again, in a lot of academic and activist spaces, there's a lot of oppositional binary way of thinking about liberation. And so a common binary that we see is the oppressed versus oppressor binary, right? This implies one is either on the side of the oppressed or the oppressor. But I guess for me, is it possible that we might find ourselves occupying both spaces, right? At least systemically is what I'm trying to say. Um, that we occupy multiple realities more than what the oppressed versus oppressor binary offers us, excuse me. And so I wonder how much of this oppositional consciousness that we kind of get stuck into contributes to how we imagine new possibilities. It gets us kind of locked into these frameworks, if you're following me here. And it can get tiring as well when we only imagine the binaries. And so this also might point to how oppositional politics might reinforce this very strict "I'm right, therefore you're wrong" approach to liberation. And it leaves very little room for transformative futures. And Anna Louise talks about this in her book. And I have a quote here somewhere. Oh, yes, where she talks about how, kind of oppositional politics leaves very little room for, quote, contradictions, overlapping perspectives, and the building of new truths. And so essentially here, the way that I dream of liberation draws greatly from this approach, and it kind of challenges me to move beyond oppositional consciousness. A sort of resistance and is how I'm looking at it. Yes, we do need to resist, but and like what comes after that, or what is through that, right? And so I think it's helpful to keep that in mind as we imagine multiple ways towards liberation. And those multiple ways might contradict. Those contradictions might appear. And so just leaving space for that is important. All right, y'all. So I'm going to now transition into the second half of this section. I'm going to do a lot less talking, and I want us to actually deeply reflect with one another for the next 30 minutes or so. And so I want us to consider, what does it mean to dream alongside with each other? What is collective dreaming? That isn't the actual reflection question, but we can certainly do that. But I just want us to kind of transition into this space of what does it mean to engage in collective dreaming and what worlds could come from this. And so I do have three broad reflections planned for us. Um, I'll now give you kind of a moment to, if you need to like get out your journals, if you have one or an app, or if you're outside and you're doing multiple things, just kind of getting into that headspace of preparing to reflect. And overall, I'm just very excited to do this. Again, like I was telling Christine and Heather earlier, I don't think we offer ourselves enough time just to sit and think and to dream because of our life practices. And so my hope is that in this session, you're inspired to make dreaming and imagining a daily practice, even if it is just for 5 minutes. And I believe that dreaming is contagious, right? It brings about this energy, especially when we're sharing our dreams with one another. But to transition into the first reflection, the first one, I'm going to invite you all to kind of reflect on your dreaming practice and what is your freedom dream. And the second reflection that we'll get into later on is We'll consider how we incorporate play into our lives. I know there was someone who mentioned that they were, I think, at a park with their children or with children. So I think that's great timing in terms of how you can incorporate that into your dream space. And then time permitting, because I like to pack a lot of things in, and then I'm like, oh gosh, maybe I did too much. If we do have time, we will reflect on who we're dreaming for and for what purpose. And so for each reflection, we'll have about 7 minutes or so. I was going to put us into breakout rooms. We do have a smaller group. So we can just do the reflections in the main session. And then after that, we can share parts of our reflections in the chat, or if you feel comfortable, you can unmute yourself and we'll repeat it for each reflection here. And so my first reflection, there's kind of two questions I'd like you to consider. This is not like our classes, right? So if we don't get to the second question, it's okay. If you don't want to answer the first question, that's okay too. I'm just giving you all prompts just to kind of guide you through this reflection. And so the first thing I'd like you to consider, if you want to, is reflecting on your current dreaming practice. If you have one, if you don't, consider why that's the case. And I'll leave this up here for you all. And then, maybe reflect on what is your freedom dream? I know that's kind of a big question, like freedom dream, what? But kind of, take that risk with me and dream of liberation, regardless of what the dominant imagination is telling us is possible. Just allow yourself to dream of that. And if it's hard for you to do that, like I put in my subpoint here, consider whose imagination, as Adrienne Marie Brown reminds us, whose imagination do you feel trapped in? And then you might also want to consider, are there allies or co-dreamers who are part of this freedom dream? So I've given you a lot to kind of go off of. Again, there's no requirement that says you have to answer, consider all of these questions and sub points. This is just a guide for you all. And as we reflect for the next 7 minutes, I'm going to play some music. If you don't want to hear that music, that's fine. You can mute our session here, but I just know for me, it's helpful for me to like kind of get me in the mindset of reflecting. So yes, 7 minutes, and then we'll share for 5 minutes and repeat for the next few reflections. Okay, so I am going to ask people to either share in the chat, it doesn't have to be your complete reflection, but maybe some main themes from your reflection from this first prompt here, and I'll go ahead and reshare my screen. Sorry for all the technological issues. All right. Okay. Are you all able to see that okay? Awesome. All right. So I can actually go ahead and go first. So I reflected a lot on my dreaming practice, to be honest with you. Dreaming as a practice, as just imagining, has become a lot more difficult for me these days. Um, I have encountered people who uh, just don't believe in the power of imagination. And so, being told that over and over again does take such a toll on you. But luckily, I was able just to be in community with other people who were able to nurture that practice. And so, as I was reflecting, I was thinking to myself, oh gosh, I'm doing that thing where I'm placing too many expectations on something that's supposed to give me a lot of joy. And so I just gave myself permission just to revamp what my dreaming practice looks like now. And I think to not do that would just not be of good service to myself. And so, yeah, all that to say, I started off with the reflection feeling like, oh gosh, I haven't really been doing it in the way that I would have liked. But then I thought, you know what? It's a dreaming practice and it's mine. And it can look like however it is for me. So that was kind of like my big reflection on my dreaming practice for sure. I'd love to hear from others in the chat, or again, if you feel comfortable muting yourself, you can, but you most certainly do not have to. We have a couple of things in the chat. Gianna said, I don't make specific time for daydreaming except when I'm lying in bed and should be, and I hope this is okay to share out loud. Please let me know if it is not. Send me a direct message. I think it would be probably be beneficial for me to set up a time during this day or during the day, so then I'm able to get a better night's sleep. Yes. I'm laughing because I can relate to that so, so much. I found myself actually intentionally daydreaming right before I went to sleep. And to be honest with y'all, I had a really great night of sleep. So, thank you so much for sharing that, Gianna. Jenny said, so their practice is, oops, I lost it already, is strongly linked to moving my body. I can strongly, strongly relate to that. I either run or horseback ride most days, and that is definitely where I do my dreaming. I think I need to be traveling through the world to unhook my brain from all the other noise. And Christina resonates with that as well. They said they also find time thinking, reflecting, and dreaming while going for a few frequent walks. Yeah, so I'm also a runner. That type of stuff helps me so much. I do a lot of yoga. And so thank you, Jenny, so much for reminding me that that is also a dream space, right? So we don't necessarily have to be journaling or doing any of those things. Your dream space is your dream space, and you can be doing that with movement. So thank you so much. Thea, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. If not, please let me know. My current dream practice is just my daily walk around the garden to check on my vegetables. Oh my gosh, what kind of vegetables do you have? Oh, I want to hear about it now. I walk around the house or about the house to check on my children. I roam and putter, sometimes thinking about how it would be great to fix this up and add this, dream of what we might do together, either in the short term or long term. Think of what we need to nourish ourselves, whether it be food or activities. That reflection really reminds me of how we can, and again, hopefully y'all will go with me in this, how we can look for non-human sources of inspiration for dreaming. Does that make sense? Like looking to our pets sometimes. I know we have some pets that are joining us that we're bringing into this space, looking into our plants, our gardens. We often sometimes don't bring those entities into the dream space, or we don't at least acknowledge that they are also sources of inspiration, great inspiration. So I just want to thank you for sharing that. Checking on your garden. I love that. I really, really like that. Let's see here. And then Heather put, I enjoy listening to music and just opening the window, listening to ambient sounds, excuse me. Sometimes I just think, sometimes I write or create something small, and that is worth it, right? I think sometimes when we dream, we feel like there has to be a point to it and not just dream or imagine. I love that. Thank you so much. Okay, so for time's sake, I'm gonna go ahead and move on. I knew I was gonna have time for the third reflection. So we'll cut it off at the second one. I'll still show you that third reflection if you don't mind. Oh, we have one more in the chat. Ty said that they don't think that, or she doesn't think that they have, or she has a consistent practice. I'm learning how ADHD makes consistency challenging. Yes, yes, absolutely. So I get inspired and go down the rabbit hole, but then forget about it again, usually until I have my students do some sort of dreaming activity, which reminds me. And again, dreaming doesn't have to be every single day. Dreaming can be consistent for what consistent means to you. So thank you so much for sharing that, Ty. All right. So like I said, for time's sake, and let me know if you can still see the screen, all that good stuff. We're going to go ahead and move on to what is now going to be our last reflection of our session. I think it's something worth considering. I know we only have 8 minutes left, so maybe we can have more of a discussion, a real-time discussion, as opposed to time to reflect individually. And that is, y'all, what happened to play in our lives? What happened to it? Not only is play good for our social life, it's amazing for our cognitive health. I'm sure not I'm sure, I know for a fact there are so many neuroscientists that have repeatedly found that play activates the reward centers of our brains, and this really floods the rest of our brain with kind of like the feel good, chemicals, the oxytocin and what have you. And that has been connected to promoting learning and mental flexibility, all that good stuff, right? And so I love how Ruha, reminds us, or also reminds us of how this concept of play and how it enables people to create possibilities out of seemingly impossibilities, right? And reading this in her book also reminded me of an activist approaches to research webinar that I attended at my institution at Ohio State, where one of the speakers, Shay Martin, argued that they look to children for sources of leaders, or as sources to lead in the imagination department, imagination as practice, if you will. And Shay said more specifically, kids are constantly imagining and creating and figuring out what is possible in this world. We most certainly, or we can certainly learn from children, and that is why I said earlier I'm bringing my nieces and my nephew here into the space. But I'm really afraid, and again, Ruha talks about this in the book as well, that we're kind of squeezing out this space for imagination, for play, for these, sort of speculative methods in our classroom. And so for those who are in the classroom or interact with students, because the classroom is not the only way that we interact with students, I want us to kind of reflect on, how do we incorporate this notion of play into our classroom or into our interactions with students, right? And if you don't know how to do this or where to start, maybe reflect on that. We can have a discussion on that. And if that doesn't really resonate with you, I know some of you all had mentioned that you're bringing your students into this space as well. And so I would invite you to maybe reflect on the dream that you have for your students that you're interacting with, whether you are a quote unquote traditional educator or you're interacting with students in a different capacity. And so I know we only have about 5 to 6 minutes left or so. If you would like, I can go back to the music and give us a couple of minutes to reflect on this, or we can just kind of have a very informal reflection in real time right now in the chat. What are some things that come to mind for you? So I'll go ahead and check to see what we have in the chat so far. Heather put here, it reminds me of an experiment when, sorry, for some reason my Zoom is being weird, or weird. They ask kids what the uses for a paperclip are. Yes, I know exactly what you're talking about, Heather, but they imagine paperclips so different from adults. Yeah, absolutely. We kind of did something similar, my wife and I, when we kept our nieces last summer. So we when we keep our nieces for an extended period of time, we call it Auntie Boot Camp because we don't have children of our own. So it feels like a boot camp to us. And so my wife took one of my nieces, Evelyn, to one of the maple trees that we have, and she picked off a leaf and she asked Evelyn, like, okay, we know that this is a leaf, but what are some other things that it could be? And just the things that Evelyn thought of, she said, well, it could be a boat, it could be a plate, it could be, it could rescue someone. She said something to that degree. She just thought of all these different things, and I thought that was just so cool, just to kind of do that activity with her, alongside with her. I love that. And Jenny put here, building in space for something new to emerge, something you create by playing together. Absolutely. Yes, the space for emergence is where. I think that's what Mia is saying. Sorry, there's something blocking that part of your message to posit the possibility of play. I love that. I love that. And like I mentioned earlier, sometimes when I invite my students to do, this is how I try to invite my students to do it. I teach journalism and public relations classes, and I ask them to kind of reimagine news cycles in the United States. Like there's this sense of urgency in breaking the news first. And I ask them to kind of reimagine what delivering news would look like if there wasn't this sense of urgency, this competitiveness to break the news first. And for some students, that was very, very challenging. Some of them even pushed back on reimagining that because they thought it was very important to be urgent and to break the news first. And so again, going back to this conflict between asking people to take the risk because it feels like a risk to imagine something different, something as simple as just reimagine what news could look like if we didn't feel like we had to break it first or have a sense of urgency. And this conflict between reimagining and then feeling a sense of comfort in the dominant imagination. That's hard. That's hard sometimes. Not in the classroom anymore, Heather said, but oh yeah, sorry. There's actually a lot of different things that I miss. I'm so sorry. Christina put obstacles to play in the classroom. I feel like I'm holding so many preconceived notions of what education is. Yep, and should be. And I'm sorry, my chat here is moving because so many people are participating. Let's see here. Yes, absolutely. I love this. I love what's going on in the chat. I know I need to read it out loud. Danny put here in my courses, undergraduate students and workshops, faculty and instructors increasingly try to incorporate creative prompts, draw a thing, create a metaphor, design something. I find this works with variable success. I appreciate this honesty. Some people really embrace it, some resist it. I think in many cases, and potentially certain disciplines, students are conditioned away from creativity and play, and that just makes me so incredibly sad. Jenny put here, yes, they are trained to discount, excuse me, anything that doesn't feel immediately relevant. Very, very hard to explore. And I just appreciate our transparency in noting that while there's a lot of joy in this space of reimagining, sometimes getting people to do that can be a great struggle. And so how do we meet people essentially where they are in this process? Absolutely. And then one last thing I'll say, because I've just noticed that we are at the top of the hour here, Heather, but sometimes I invite my students to think creatively. For example, this semester I asked my students if they were a vehicle, what vehicle would they be? One student said she would be a bus and take all of her friends on trips. I like that. And I like to do those silly prompts too. Well, I shouldn't say silly. It feels silly to us, but they're not, right? They're inviting students to be creative and play. And I also do that on occasion, especially during like the midterm, very stressful time of the semester where that creative play, fun spirit tends to be sucked out of students and ourselves. I love doing that just to kind of like get the ick out. Yes, this is great. This is great. Well, I do want to be considerate of everyone's time. The latter part of this session was more of a free flow. There were a couple of things that we weren't able to get to, was less structured, but that is perfectly okay. I love hearing from you all and just having that discussion about imagination and play and how sometimes it's easy and difficult for some of us. And so I just essentially want to leave you all with this my final thoughts as we talk about imagination. And I'm really drawing from the work of Robert D.G. Kelly. Some of you are probably familiar with their work. And they remind us to imagine to build and not just to dismantle. And I kind of go on and say that imagining for the sole purpose of dismantling or critique is not enough and it's not sustainable. So going back to like oppositional consciousness may not be enough or sustainable. We must imagine to rebuild and rejoice in the future, imagining a joyous future. And so with that, I'll go ahead and leave you all. Thank you so, so much. There's my contact information if you do want to reach out to me. Um, I know there are some people who are still on X or Twitter. I'm not on it as much, but I am on Instagram now. And of course, there is my email. Thank you.